What's happening, everybody? It's Sean with Reactions to the Classics. Today we got a status quo top 10 songs reaction brought to us by our friend, longtime supporter and patron of the channel, Evan David. Thank you, Evan David. Appreciate you. Appreciate all the patrons who make this thing go. If you'd like to support us in any way, check out the Patreon link below or the patron link on the end screen. We could not do it without the patrons. All right. Evan David's always very thorough in his research. This is all his research, none of mine. So if you want to listen to the songs, they're not going to be, and we're going to have videos too, they're not going to be in the reaction here on YouTube because they would get blocked. So click on that Vimeo link below right now and you can just watch the full reaction. All right, let's get into it. These are all Evan David's facts. I don't know anything about Status Quo, by the way, nothing. I live in the US, never heard one of their songs to my knowledge. We might find out differently once we get into this, but let's go. Rock and roll legend has it that the genesis of the band that will become Status Quo can be traced back as far as 1962 when two 13-year-old London-based schoolmates, Francis, it's Rossi or Rossi, I say Rossi, lead guitar and vocals, and Alan Lancaster, bassist, first formed a group called the Paladins alongside their fellow students, Alan Key on drums and Jess Jaworski on keyboards, which would soon go on to perform its first proper gig in Dulwich, South London in May that year. As Francis would later recall, there were various other gigs we were going to do and we backed out. And then Alan Lancaster's dad worked for a firm called Samuel Jones, who were something to do with metalwork and stuff like that. And they had a sports ground in Dulwich and they had to work there once or something. So Alan's dad came in and said, "I've got you two a booking." And I thought, if his dad's involved, Alan definitely has to go. So we turn up at this thing and we set up and I'm blanking myself and I couldn't play naff all. I was just happy to strum. We got about £5, which was marvelous at the time. We played there again a month later and this guy walked up to us and said, "I'm a manager. You better go ask Alan and ask Alan's mom," I said. And she said it was all right and that this is Pat Barlow, who was great. Over the next few years under Barlow's auspices, meanwhile, the group would not only see fit to rename themselves as a seemingly more impressive sounding Spectres, but would also acquire the services of both a new drummer, John Coghlan, and a new keyboard player, Roy Limes, to boot. Meanwhile, Barlow's own early managerial efforts, which had already secured gigs for the band at various venues in London, would seemingly finally reach fruition when he succeeded in gaining them a then prestigious residency at the Butlins Holiday Camp in Minehead, Somerset, for the summer of 1965, a place where they would have what would, albeit unbeknownst to either party at the time, later turn out to be a truly fateful encounter with their future rhythm guitarist, the then 16-year-old Rick Parfitt. Parfitt, who was in performing at the camp alongside two twin sisters, Jean and Gloria Harrison, as part of a cabaret-style trio called the Highlights, would himself later recall that, quote, "I was rehearsing with the girls one day and I heard this terrific din coming from somewhere. I realized it was a rock and roll band and it sounded really good. So after we'd finished for the day, I just sort of wandered in the direction of the noise, and there they were, the Spectres hammering out Roll Over Beethoven. I was utterly transfixed. I saw that they were still only kids like me, but it was obvious they were a proper rock and roll band just from the way they stood there and played together. They were full of attitude and looked like a real gang, and I just had to say hello and tell them how good they were because they were really very good. Francis and I got on just like that, forging a great real friendship almost from the off. It was the start of something for me, the secret thought that maybe one day I could do something like that too," end quote. Meanwhile, by the time that Parfitt would finally get his chance to join the band in mid-1967, they had already signed a 5-year deal with Piccadilly Records, a subsidiary of Pye Records, and released 4 flop singles in succession, none of which managed to enter the UK singles chart. Moreover, they'd also changed their name once more, this time to the Traffic Jam. Although shortly after Parfitt joined, they would find themselves having to do so yet again in order to avoid confusion, of course, with the Steve Winwood-led Traffic, finally settling and calling themselves the Status Quo, a name which it turned out would stick for the rest of the band's career to this day. The newly named Quo would finally achieve their chart breakthrough in January 1968 with the release of the psychedelic-sounding tune Pictures of Matchstick Men, of more of which later, which both reached number 7 in the UK and even managed to reach number 12 in the US. And while this long-awaited success was an undoubtedly welcome result of the band being able to effectively tap into prevailing pop culture trends and fashions, it nevertheless also brought with it what might be described as a certain sense of artistic confusion on the part of the band members themselves, with Rossi later astutely summing up the musical results as follows, quote, "When we broke, we were a rock band with a soul set and a psychedelic single. I didn't even know what psychedelic meant. I was copying things," end quote. As a result, when the band's initial early bout of chart success began to wane, even as the psychedelic era itself began to come to a close by the end of the 1960s, Status Quo, who by 1969 had already dropped the part of their name, which in itself perhaps signaled a change in direction from the more hippie-esque trappings that the band had adopted, were more than happy to embrace the more, quote, back-to-basics musical zeitgeist that was beginning to prevail at the time, with Rossi later explaining how, quote, we weren't sure yet exactly which direction we wanted to take the band in. We just knew that both musically and fashion-wise, we had simply wearied all of the whole image-building thing. The idea was to have no image. Musically, what prompted the change was was when we noted how we were starting to enjoy the sound checks at gigs, where we would muck about and play all sorts of different things, more than the actual gigs themselves. Alan had brought in this bluesy shuffle called Junior's Wailing that he suggested we do, and that kind of set the template for the new blues rock sound we would start to explore. I admit that I wasn't sure at first. Then one night at a club in Germany, Rick and I heard Roadhouse Blues by the Doors, and that's when we thought, yeah, we'll have some of that. Quo's new, more no-nonsense musical approach, which was itself heralded by the release of their new blues single, Down the Dustpipe in 1970, began to pay dividends largely out the back of fan word of mouth based on a truly relentless touring schedule, with the band's ever-energetic performance style leading to their by now four-piece official lineup of Rossi, Parfit, Lancaster, and Coghlan being dubbed the so-called Frantic Four by their steadily increasing fan base. Technically, the fifth member of the band by this point was one Andy Brown, who had eventually replaced Roy Limes as the band's main keyboard player following the latter's departure in 1970. But Brown wasn't credited as a full member of the band until 1981. Such widespread popular acclaim, which helped the band rack up hit after hit on both the UK singles and album charts during the rest of the 70s and beyond, was no doubt even more important in Status Quo's case, given the widespread dislike, if not outright contempt, which a critical music press often held for both their music and for the band as a whole. As Rossi himself later acknowledged, quote, because of our image as a no-frills rock band, all our hits back then were perceived the same way, unpretentious rock and roll for the long-haired, denim-clad masses. Fair comment, and I'm more than happy to stand by that, of course. The music papers were always fond of pointing out that there didn't appear to be much meaning to our lyrics, and at the time, I would have agreed with them. Putting, quote, meaning into the lyrics was never top of my agenda when it came to writing a song. The tune was everything, and the words would be written to fit with it, not the other way around. So just remember that at that time. It was the sound of the words I was interested in and how they complemented the melody. After several more, quote, meaningless hits, the critics then took to accusing us of having a magic formula, which allowed us to simply recycle the same old stuff over and over, giving birth to the heads down, three-chord, mindless boogie jibes that still haunt us to this day. The answer to which is, I wish we had, because if we had, we definitely wouldn't have changed it just to suit some critic. But all that kind of talk is rubbish. We were aware that we now had a Quo signature sound, and we were proud of it. We had reached the exalted stage where the minute one of our records came on the radio, you knew immediately who it was, the same as with all the best bands from the Stones to U2. That didn't mean we wanted to keep repeating ourselves. Despite all their undoubted commercial success, however, as the 80s dawned, the cracks within the band were beginning to show as the pressures resulting from their aforementioned relentless touring schedule combined with the impact that excessive use of alcohol and or drugs in order to cope with said demands only served to push several personality clashes that had been brewing for years between the members of Quo to breaking point and beyond. The first of the Frantic Four to leave would be drummer John Coghlan in 1981 after an incident when he apparently kicked over his drum kit in a drunken rage and walked out of the studio during a recording session. Alan Lancaster would later recall the aftermath as follows, quote, we're in a hotel room that night and Francis came in with our touring manager at the time and said, we think John should go and we should get somebody else in. We can't stand it, end quote. And me and Rick thought, oh, this will blow over tomorrow. Yeah, okay, man. We carried on playing our game of backgammon. Next day, Rick and I were down in the breakfast room and the tour manager came in and said, John's on his way to London. He's gone back. And Pete, who I'd worked with before, we'd all worked with Pete before, Pete Kircher, great drummer, came in and we recorded the album. We forgot about John. So John was out and that was the start. That was unthinkable at the time and it was never the same since. We made bad albums after that. And then Evan David says, for his own part, Coghlan himself would later admit that, quote, it had been creeping up on me. I always felt that we never got enough rest. There were parties every night. Also, things weren't happy for me at home in those days, and nobody in the band was too interested in anybody else's problems. It was such a shame because the original band were the blank hot, and we allowed it to fall apart. Over the next couple of years, therefore, it seemed that Quo were increasingly on the verge of imploding, and their existing issues only being exacerbated further by increasing artistic differences between Lancaster, who wanted the band to stick to a more hard-rocking style, and Rossi, who was more than happy to adopt a more pop-style approach when called for on songs such as the entertaining but decidedly lightweight Margarita Time, which became one of the biggest hits when it reached number 3 on the UK singles charts in 1983, but which Lancaster loathed, refusing to have anything to do with the promotion. Yeah, that's letting you know there's problems. Such tensions would in turn push an increasingly disillusioned Rossi to insist that the band give up performing live following one farewell tour in 1984, with Rossi later describing how by the end of said tour, everybody was coked up and hating each other, and I'd started drinking tequila. I don't remember that last show at all, the encores or anything, just falling flat on my back at one point. Parfit, on the other hand, would be far more reluctant to see status quo come to what he felt was too premature of an end, later recalling how, quote, "We did that farewell gig, and I remember being on stage at Milton Keynes there thinking, well, we finished Caroline. You think, God, that's the last time I'm ever going to play that? Never going to play this again?" End quote. Evan Davis says, as it turned out, however, Status Quo's apparent demise as an active performing band would last only for 1 year, as the band's various problems and disputes would be overcome, at least temporarily, by the Herculean efforts of the human force of nature that was and is Bob Geldof, who took it upon himself to persuade them to accept what would eventually turn out to be the prime opening slot at the London portion of the legendary Live Aid charity concert in July 1985. Rossi, for one, would later recall how, quote, "I said, look, Bob, we ain't getting on. We ain't rehearsed." And he said, "It doesn't matter an F what you sound like." But all credit to him. He got us all down there. So we went on first, and every friggin' newsreel in the world carried us. It's show business, right? After the event, I think Dire Straits' album went whoosh. So did Tina Turner, and so did U2, but some of us didn't have any extra product out. Alan Lancaster, meanwhile, who by this time was mostly living in Australia with his girlfriend, himself later recalled how, quote, "I think it was a few minutes to 12 when we went on stage at Live Aid. Little did I know 20 minutes later that would be the last chord I'd ever play with Quo. We got on great that day. It was a fantastic day. I was staying with Rick in Rick's apartment. We were having great fun. I spent most of the day with Francis. We was walking around everywhere, and I flew back to Australia not long after that. About a week after, and received a letter from the management office signed by Francis, typed out by the office, obviously with their address, and signed by Francis saying they didn't want to work with me anymore because the end of the road had really come." Indeed, while Status Quo's then record company was insistent that the band record a new album in order to cash in on their success at Live Aid, Rossi was by now insistent that Lancaster could no longer be part of the band that they had co-founded over 2 decades before, with the result that despite later unsuccessful attempts at legal action on Lancaster's behalf in order to stop the band's new lineup of Rossi, Parfit, Andy Brown on keyboards, and new members John Rhino Edwards on bass and Jeff Rich on drums from using the Status Quo name, the regenerated Quo would return to the high reaches of both the UK album and singles charts in 1986 with a highly commercial successful In the Army Now. Parfit would later describe the genesis of said new Quo lineup as follows. "I had done a solo album called Recorded Delivery, which I was really proud of. I loved it. And on this album, producer Pip Williams had said to me, you've got to use this bass player and this drummer, respectively John Rhino Edwards and Jeff Rich. Then the record company said, Quo, we want another album off you. So I said to Francis, look, I've met this best bass player and this drummer. I said, you'll like them. They're good eggs, nice people. He said, He wasn't keen at all. I said, we've got to do it. So we ended up in the studio. There was no tension. There was no aggro with these 2 new guys. It was fresh, and it worked wonderfully. Over the next few decades, and while there would be other lineup changes on occasion, the group's now core duo of Rossi and Parfit would drive Status Quo to become what Quo expert Richard James has dubbed, quote, a British institution playing pop-based boogie with a highly commercial edge to an audience that spans entire generations of families. As such, and despite occasional disquiet amongst Quo fans and even the band members themselves at perhaps being overly commercially focused, with often record company-driven releases of both cover albums and compilations, sitting-long albums of original material, as Rossi himself once memorably remarked, it was all right being a household name, but that didn't mean I wanted the band to turn into a box of soap powder. The overall process of this approach in terms of sheer sales and other numbers alone cannot be denied. To quote Richard James once again, Status Quo's total worldwide record sales exceeds 118 million units. They've released over 100 singles, made 106 appearances on Top of the Pops, and spent over 415 weeks, 7.5 years in old money in the UK singles charts. Their UK albums chart success is eclipsed only by the Rolling Stones. Quo's legendary gigging schedule means that they have played an estimated 6,000 plus shows to a total of in excess of 25 million people. This also translates into traveling approximately 4 million miles and spending over 23 years away from home. I'll just interject here. It's crazy. I don't even know this band at all, and they got that kind of success in the UK. Evan David says, happily for longtime Status Quo fans, all this would include 2 reunion tours for the Frantic Four lineup of Rossi, Parfit, Lancaster, and Coughlin in 2013 and 2014, which were not only financially lucrative, of course, but which also served to show that all 4 men had, by and large, patched up their differences by that point and would remain on friendly terms from then on. Sadly, while the passage of time may have indeed healed all wounds in this case, it would also take its toll on some of the band members themselves, with the notoriously hard-living Parfit, who had suffered intermittent health problems over the years since undergoing a quadruple heart bypass in 1997, being the first to succumb when he died of a sepsis infection on Christmas Eve 2016, followed suit by Lancaster, who had himself perished due to complications from MS in September of 2021. As of this writing, and with Coughlin still pursuing his own solo career, this leaves Rossi as a sole surviving core member of the current incarnation of Status Quo, who released their 33rd and most recent studio album, Backbone, in 2019, and who continue performing to this day, befitting the description that Parfit once gave of Quo as, quote, like being a steam train, and it's going down that straight track, and it's powerful, and it's pumping along this track, a real proper steam engine, and all the trends are in the way, and it just knocks them all out of the way, and we just plow through. Nothing's going to stop this engine, which is Quo. That's the way we've always looked at it. Evan David says, as a longtime casual fan of Status Quo myself since my own early teenage years in the mid-90s, I can vividly recall a girl at school telling me that it was one thing being heavily into the Beatles, as I was, but the Status Quo were completely uncool, and indeed I often regard the band as being sort of a reverse Ramones, in that while both bands have been derided for playing apparently simple, if not simplistic music, Status Quo had all the commercial success and more that the latter group craved. I've got the first 5 Ramones albums up, by the way, and a Ramones Top 10 that Evan David did, so search for that afterwards. Even as critics who seemingly love the punk sensibility of the Ramones would happily deride the likes of Quo as old-fashioned musical dinosaurs. Nevertheless, however, going through Quo's entire discography, which remembers 33 albums, as preparation for compiling this top 10 list, has only reinforced my earlier impression that there's an awful lot of good and at the very least fun music to be found amongst their vast body of work. While I do not regard this particular top 10 list of big hits and personal favorites as definitive in any way, or indeed as anything more than a starting point for hopefully lively discussion in the comments below, it nevertheless gives me great pleasure to introduce Sean and the rest of the RTTC community to the work of a much beloved people's band who may never have caught on in America for some reason, but who remain one of the UK's most successful bands regardless, and for darn good reason, as I hope you'll agree after hearing these top 10 songs in particular. All right, once again, a reminder, the music and the videos are not going to be in this video. Click on the Vimeo link if you haven't already. Let's kick it off with Carolyn or Caroline. I'll know when I hear it, when they sing it. First released as a single in August 1973, reaching 5 in the UK, and then as part of Quo's 6th studio album, Hello, in September of that same year. This joyously catchy Quo tune was apparently first written on a hotel table napkin by Rossi and his frequent songwriting collaborator, roadie, and harmonica player Bob Young, with Rossi himself later noting that the finished product was, quote, far removed from the much slower, straight-laced country tune Bob and I had originally conceived. The band had breathed new life into it, and it turned into a real rocker. We still open with it to this day, their shows. John Coughlin, meanwhile, also stated elsewhere that it's a great opener because that intro, that great guitar riff is fantastic, and it's still good to hear it today. I thought it was one of the greatest songs the band ever wrote, end quote. While the long-rumored Quo songwriting hit formula may indeed be something of a myth, Evan David says, therefore, if it did exist, then perhaps the Status Quo song that would sound a lot like Caroline, which Richard James, for one, describes as, quote, a timeless classic and justifiably so, it captures a joyful, optimistic spirit of early rock and roll and places it firmly inside a sensational hard rock groove, end quote. As such, Evan David says, I'd like you to please react to this clip of the song being performed live at Live Aid concert in Wembley Stadium, London in July 1985. All right, I'm going to have the lyrics up as always. Thanks again, Evan David. All right, Caroline, as they talked about, Sweet Caroline. A fun performance. I watched this performance. I have no recollection of it, but I watched Live Aid, and it was quite the scene, man. If you're alive back then and watched, some we'll never be able to recreate in this fractured world where we can all choose whatever we want through streaming video and streaming music, and no one will ever come together like that where the whole world is watching them. But it's cool and it's crazy they were chosen to open it. What an honor. Next up at number 9, we got Pictures of Matchstick Men. First released as a single in January 68, as Evan David talked about earlier, reaching 7 in the UK, 12 on the US chart, and then as part of Quo's debut studio album, Picturesque Matchstickable Messages from the Status Quo. In September the same year, according to his composer Francis Rossi, this whimsical slice of psychedelia was written in decidedly prosaic circumstances. As quote, I wrote it on the bog. I'd gone there, but for the usual reasons, but to get away. I'd gone there, but not for the usual reasons, but to get away from wife and mother-in-law. I used to go into this narrow, frizzing toilet and sit there for hours until they finally went out. I got 3/4 of the song finished there. The rest I finished in the lounge. End quote. Evan David says the net result of this would not only be a cracking little tune in its own right, but also goes on to show just how far removed the early Status Quo were from their later frayed jeans and t-shirt image. As you can see by yourself by reacting to the clip of the song performed live on Top of the Pops all the way back in February of 1968. All right, pictures of Matchstick Men. I mean, the video itself had the lyrics in there. I didn't have the subtitles on there. So you can kind of see that this song is really about nothing. So a little allusion to the songwriting that was mentioned earlier in the intro. But I don't know this song, but it has a familiar sound. I guess it's the sound of that day. But I liked it, man. I thought it was good. I thought the guitar in there was particularly good. All right, next up at number 8, we got Rolling Home. First released as a single in May of 1986, reaching 9 in the UK, and is part of Quo's 17th studio album, In the Army Now, in August that same year. And not to be confused with the earlier track Rolling Home, which Quo had released as part of their 9th studio album, Blue for You, a full decade before. This bittersweet tale of the homesick longings of a working man being punished for unknown crimes in far-off foreign climes has long been one of my own personal favorite Evan David Says Quo songs. It goes to show that the band's newly regenerated post-Frantic 4 lineup hadn't lost their hit-making magic touch one bit. So all the songs except for one you're going to see below in the Spotify bar, but you're not going to see the Spotify bar moving when I play this song because none of Evan David's top 10, except a couple of songs that we're actually watching the videos for, was available on Spotify off the album. So I don't know what versions these are that I found on Spotify. I just put them in the bar below so you can see it. So I'm actually going to be listening to an audio version that Evan David provided of all these different songs. It's the version that he wants. It's the correct version. All right, Rolling Home. Very catchy. Thought it was really well done. He sounds good. Guitar works nice. So it's a good pick for number 8. Next up at number 7, we got Mystery Song, the album version. First released as part of Quo's 9th studio album, Blue for You, in March of 1976. Then in an edited down single version in July of the same year, reaching 11 in the UK. The somewhat sprawling yet still compelling saga of an encounter with a lady of negotiable affection serves as a strong reminder of Status Quo's lingering potential to expand beyond their stereotypical musical image into more advanced, if not slightly more progressive musical territory, with its composer Parfit explaining its chemically enhanced genesis. Thus, quote, we got to the studio, I was going to have a cup of tea, and Francis whacked a couple of spoonfuls of speed in my tea, and I didn't know that he'd done it. So I drank the tea, and everybody left the studio at 8, 9 o'clock that evening. I'm still going. I'm still flying, and I got this tuning, which I love, this open G tuning that I started to mess about with. It was one of those things where everything sounded good, you know, because you're away with the fairies. And I sat there all night and played that. When they came back in the morning, I had the Mystery Song. I think I had the lyrics, everything. Just did it overnight, and you get so wrapped up in it. All right, Mystery Song. About 6.5 minutes long. The single version's 2.5 minutes shorter, so I'm sure they cut out some of those instrumental runs, but shows off their musicianship. Good song. Next up at number 6 in Evan David's top 10 Status Quo songs, we got Paper Plane. First released as a single in November 1972, reaching 8 in the UK. It's part of Quo's 5th studio album, Pile Driver, in December that same year. This propulsively powerful tune quickly became a long-standing favorite amongst concert-going Quo fans, and whose psychedelic prog rock-sounding lyrics, which is composed by Rossi himself, once noted, riding on a big white butterfly, physically not possible. Turn my back away towards the sky. The F's he's saying there, but if you had a joint, it's, yeah, I know what you mean, man, are excitingly underwritten throughout by what Richard James aptly calls, quote, a spectacular 3-chord blitz on the senses. Paper Plane is the perfect blend of power, melody, and commercial catchiness, which showcases Quo at one of their several best. Utterly fantastic 5 decades on Paper Plane is the perfect calling card for the classic rock band, which Quo would rightly claim to be. All right, Paper Plane, just a fun song, catchy, great guitar stuff, 3 minutes, perfect what you want in a nice little fun song. All right, now we're into the top 5. We got Living on an Island. First released as part of Quo's 12th studio album, Whatever You Want, in October of 79. This is a single in November the same year, reaching 16 in the UK. The similarly laid-back acoustic-sounding tune is nevertheless, as Richard James aptly describes it, quote, a deceptively complex composition. The relaxed strumming of the beautifully recorded acoustic guitar suits the supposedly holiday feel of its words perfectly. but Living on an Island has a darker undertone and references loneliness and drug abuse and apparently idyllic surroundings, end quote. Indeed, co-writer Rick Parfitt in turn describes its origins thus as, I was doing a tax year and I was flitting around Europe, and it was then suggested that we all go and hole up on the island of Jersey. There wasn't a lot to do on the island, really, you know. So I started the song off with Bob Young, I think, and we just talked about being bored, really. Living on an island waiting for somebody to come out, to sneak a bit of cocaine onto the island, because bad news there, you know. And that song was really lovely, and it reflected the time spent on Jersey. So I suppose you could say if something good came out of it, it was living on an island. But I was going out of my skull, just didn't know what to do. So you used to start drinking and doing what you can. It was a wild tune. End quote. Evan Davis says Francis Rossi, on the other hand, would himself astutely note how, quote, there was always this thing of the singles all sound the same. And as soon as we did Living on an Island, the first question was, why have you done something so different? Which is so frustrating as soon as you did something different. And yet when people look back, they still say they're all the same. All right, Living on an Island. Good lyrics, definitely a different sound. I really enjoyed the sound. My only little detriment to the song is just too long. It's 5 minutes long. It could have been like 3.5 minutes long. It would have been my favorite song on here if it would have been, but still a good song. All right, next up, the only song I don't have a Spotify bar for, Accident Prone. First release as part of Quo's 11th studio album, If You Can't Stand the Heat, in October of 78, and then as a single in November the same year, reaching a relatively lowly 36 in the UK. This fun, bouncy, and decidedly underrated song quickly emerges one of my personal favorite Quo tunes, Evan David says, while I was going through their entire discography in preparation for compiling this list. Nice repeating guitar riff there. I mean, catchy song. Well done. I can see why it's stuck in Evan David's head after listening to all of these songs. We got 3 tunes left. You see it below. Whatever You Want, first released as a single in September of 79, reaching 4 in the UK, and as the title track to Quo's aforementioned 12th studio album in October the same year. This irresistible tune, and especially its once heard, never forgotten, infectiously catchy intro, has long been perhaps my own personal favorite Quo song. Sentiment shared by none other than its composer Rick Parfitt, who once said that, quote, it's probably the song that I'm most proud of contributing to Quo, end quote. Small wonder then that Francis Rossi would aptly and accurately describe Parfitt's creation in turn as being, quote, simply one of those songs that completely defines and affirms the Quo musical identity. It's also got that great quality all the best songs have of having universal appeal. Your body starts reacting to it before your brain even knows what's going on. As a result, it remains one of the big highlights of any Quo show. Whatever You Want, very infectious. I super enjoyed it. I thought the guitar work was fantastic. So for me so far, I don't want to give away my favorites. This was my favorite song, but we still got 2 songs left. We have Down Down, first released as a single in November of 1974, reaching number 1 in the UK. It's part of Quo's 8th studio album, On the Level, in February of 75. His co-writer Rossi once explained how, quote, I always saw records like Down Down as essentially pop songs done in the rock mode. Catchy tunes done forward of the bar. The song was a dual-purpose message for me to both my wife and the press at the time. I always assure people it has nothing to do with going down in any sense, but of course they never believe me. People put their own meaning into things, especially music. Evan David says, I'd like you to please react to this clip of the fast-paced, irresistibly powerful headbanger of a song being performed live on the Dutch music TV show Top Pop in February of 1975. All right, Down Down. I mean, I'll get into it at the end, but I mean, these songs definitely sound the same, right? But this song was very catchy as well. I know I'm just saying the same stuff because they're all constructed almost the same way. But nice song. The only knock on this had nothing to do with the Quo. It had to do with the spinning of the camera. Not really a good thing. And here we are, number 1, Rocking All Over the World, first released as a single in September of 1977, reaching 3 in the UK as the title track of their 10th studio album in November of the same year. This truly iconic Quo tune was in fact a cover of a song that had originally been performed by ex-Creedence Clearwater Revival frontman John Fogerty, with Rick Parfitt once describing how, quote, I was driving home from town one night. I was probably out of it. I don't remember, but the song came on the radio and I never heard it before. I obviously knew John Fogerty, but I'd never heard this Rocking All Over the World. And I thought, what a great song. The chorus, that would be so great for us. And the fact I'd never heard it, I thought, well, this couldn't have been a hit here. You know, it just turned out magic straight away. It was magical. And we started this way. Now we're going to end this way. We're going to look at a performance from Live Aid. All right, Rocking All Over the World, a fun rendition. The crowd was really into it. You could see that. So a good way to finish off this list. And before we get to my favorite tracks, we got Evan David. There's a lot of them, so I'm going to fire them off quickly. Ice in the Sun, Down the Dust Pipe, Mean Girl, Nana Nana, Roll Over, Lay Down, Softer Ride, Is There a Better Way, Can't Give You More, Again and Again, What You're Proposing, Rock and Roll, Something About You, Baby, I Like, Dear John, Burning Bridges, Rock Till You Drop, Pennsylvania Blues Tonight, and especially Break the Rules, Rain, Old Bag Blues, In the Army Now, Red Sky, Fun, Fun, Fun with the Beach Boys, Jam Side Down, and Beginning of the End. Now we'll get to my favorite tracks. You know, I mean, I did allude to it in the song before the last one, in Down, Down. A lot of these songs sound the same, right? And they might not to you if you know all these songs because you've heard them a bunch of. I'm just talking on first listen, sitting here. They're all very similar. That's not a bad thing. I mean, that they had success. You can't argue with their success. Their success is insane. So honorable mentions, Pictures of Matchstick Men, which didn't sound. It was one of the outliers. But, you know, it was 1968, the psychedelic tune. Rolling Home, Living on an Island, also different sound. Phase, Whatever You Want, and Down, Down. But let me know what you think of the list down below. Remember, Evan David listened to every single album. He did his due diligence, but he said this is not an authoritative list. So let me know what you think of this list down below. What are your favorites, and what else would you include in there if you haven't already? Give it a thumbs up. Hit that big red subscribe button. Another big shout out to Evan David for all the work he puts into these. And until next time, guys, I will see you.